Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pictures of the Scene podcast, a true crime podcast aimed at putting you, the listener, at the scene of the crime. Now, today I'm by myself because we've had trouble, Rach and myself, getting together recently for work commitments and personal commitments, and Rachel's off on holiday now, so it'd be a good few weeks before we got together again, so I thought I'm just going to throw a couple of episodes out there just because I miss recording, and also so all of you, our listeners, don't have to wait much longer, so please do like, subscribe, all that nice nonsense that I always talk about, but I'm just going to jump straight into it so we can get going. So thank you, everyone, and bear with me because I'm by myself, so you can be my friend today. Also, everyone, I'm going to try a different format today because I'm by myself. I can try something a little bit new, so let me know what you think. And if you like it, I can adapt it so it matches for two of us when we're both together again. It's a few minutes before 8 a.m. on Friday the 28th of April, 2023, and we're in Nottingham city centre, in the entrance foyer of a block of flats called High Cross Leys, where Huntingdon Street meets Woodborough Road. A young man comes down the stairs, 22 years old. He's struggling to walk. He pulls off his t-shirt as he moves, and he's bleeding because a few minutes earlier, in a flat upstairs, someone drove a knife into his chest. He makes it as far as the foyer, and there, by the entrance, collapses. Now, there's a CCTV camera in that foyer, and what it records over the next few minutes is the reason I'm telling you this story. So a man and woman come down the stairs. They step over him. They don't speak to him. They don't touch him. They walk out of the building and they keep walking. And then another man comes down, an older man. And when he reaches the young man on the floor, he stops. He stays. At one point, he takes hold of his hand. He sets off the emergency fire alarm because an alarm brings people and people bring help. A passerby on his way home from the gym sees what's happening and stops too. And it's that stranger who calls 999. So the paramedics do everything they can. So does the hospital. And at 9:36 a.m., the young man dies. His name was Davices Anderson, though everyone called him Ricardo. So that's what I'm going to call him too today. Almost exactly 12 months later, at Nottingham Crown Court, two men were convicted of his murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. One of them was a man who stepped over Ricardo's body on his way out the door. The other was the man who held his hand. So what happened to Ricardo took seconds, in a room almost nobody saw into. The only person who says she did see it was a woman the courts would spend years deciding whether to believe, and she died 8 days after she finally told police what she saw. And then, on the 15th of July 2026, just days before I recorded this, 3 days to be exact, the Court of Appeal in London looked at all of it, everything, and ruled that one of these two murder convictions should never have happened at all. So I want to start with Ricardo, because everything in this story flows through him. And because if I'm not careful, the courts and the lawyers and the legal arguments will crowd him out of his own story. And that happens a lot in cases like this one. And it's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen today. So Davices Anderson was 22 years old when he died. At his killer's sentencing, the judge described him as a much-loved son, a dad, a brother, and an uncle. His mother, Hayley, told the court that no one expects to bury their child, and that his soul was kind and bright. His brother Kai called him his best friend, taken without a chance to say goodbye. That's who he was to the people who loved him. Now here's where he was in April 2023. Ricardo had nowhere to live. That's recorded as a fact in the Court of Appeal's judgment. He was staying on a temporary basis in a flat at High Cross Leys, occupied by a man named Courtney McLeary, then aged 53, and McLeary's partner, Lisa Barlow. McLeary had taken Ricardo in. One person who knew them both put it this way: McLeary had taken Ricardo under his wing. Now I need to be straight with you about the world this story takes place in, because pretending otherwise wouldn't survive contact with the evidence. The flat at High Cross Leys was, on the night Ricardo died, a place where almost everyone present was smoking crack cocaine and heroin. That's the agreed evidence, accepted by both the prosecution and defence alike at the trial. And Ricardo was a part of that world, and that world is part of why he died where he did, with only strangers and CCTV to record it. A 22-year-old using Class A drugs in a flat he was sleeping in because he had nowhere else to go is a young man in trouble. He was also, in the words of someone who was there that night, a typical cheeky lad. He had his ups and downs, he had his own issues, but he was 22 years old. Whatever else happened in that flat, And I'll get exactly to what the court say happened. Nobody deserved what was done to him in the early hours of the 28th of April. So let's get on to the night itself, shall we? On the evening of the 27th of April 2023, McLeary and Barlow cooked dinner and invited people around to the flat. Now Ricardo was there. So was a woman named Katrina Intress. And by the end of this episode, hers is a name that you're going to know best. So people came and went all evening. And at one point, Ricardo, McLeary, and Ricardo's girlfriend left the flat together to buy more drugs. In the taxi coming back, Ricardo produced a weapon. Witnesses would later describe it differently, some calling it a tomahawk, others a hammer with a blade attached to it. The Court of Appeal settled on a simpler description. It was just a weapon, and Ricardo carried it back into the flat. Now, the evidence about the hours that followed was agreed by everyone at the trial. Through the course of that night, Ricardo was aggressive and violent. At times, he produced weapons, and in particular, over a period of time, he made repeated threats to Lisa Barlow, McLeary's partner, and was extremely aggressive toward her. The gathering carried on through the night. Most people drifted away. By the early hours of the morning of the 28th of April, only a few remained. And it seems those who stayed had been up the entire night. Ricardo was there, McLeary and Barlow were there, Katrina Intress was there, and so was a man named David Francis, then 60 years old, from Bingham, a market town about 9 miles east of Nottingham. Shortly before 8 a.m., in the sitting room of that flat, after what the prosecution would later say was roughly 15 minutes of calm, violence broke out. A knife was produced, and Ricardo was stabbed through the heart. What exactly happened in that room in those few seconds is a question this entire case turns on. Because of the people who were there, one is dead, two were on trial, and at the time said nothing in the witness box. And the only person with a claim to have watched the knife go in died before she could be asked a single question about it. So I'm going to take the next few minutes in the order that they happened. Who leaves that flat, when, and what each of them does on the way out. The Court of Appeal watched exactly this on that foyer CCTV over and over again. Their words, the court has viewed that footage many times. First though, the room itself. Here's what's actually established, as opposed to claims about the stabbing. It was never in dispute, not at the trial and not on appeal, that the hand holding the knife belonged to Courtney McLeary. He stabbed Ricardo. The fatal wound was a single stab to the chest that went through the chest wall and into his heart. Now Ricardo had other wounds too, other stab wounds among them. What was in dispute, fiercely might I add, was everything around that fact and how it started. Why, whether it was a sudden attack or self-defense, or, as McLeary suggested at one point to police, an accident in a struggle. So I'm going to come back to all of that. In the end, it's a whole case. What happens next is on camera and on the record. Katrina Intress leaves first, and she leaves fast. Then Ricardo, wounded, bleeding, he gets himself out of the flat and down the stairs to the ground floor into that entrance foyer. He pulls off his t-shirt. He collapses by the entrance. A few minutes pass. Then McLeary appears in the foyer with Lisa Barlow. And this is a moment from my opening. They step over him. The man McLeary had taken under his wing, died on the floor of the building McLeary lives in. No word, no touch. They just walk out. Then David Francis comes down. And Francis is the other man from the opening. The one who stops. He stays with Ricardo. At one point, he holds his hand. He sets off the emergency fire alarm in the common area. And when police are there to ask him why he stayed, his answer is an interview record. A member of his own family had died from being stabbed, and he was very concerned for Ricardo. Now, a man called Colby Bunyan is walking home from the gym. He sees what's happening, and he stops too, and he stays. And it's Colby Bunyan who calls for the police and the paramedics. And Ricardo, on the floor of that foyer, says something to the stranger. So he tells Colby Bunyan that he'd been mugged or attacked by a group. A dying man's words to the one person there with no connection to that flat at all. And 3 years later, whether Ricardo was attacked by a group, plural, or by one man with a knife, is what the Court of Appeal will have to decide. The paramedics reach him. He's taken to hospital. At 9:36 a.m. on Friday the 28th of April 2023, despite everything the medical staff could try, Ricardo dies. The investigation now moves quickly and it spreads wide. By that Friday, Nottinghamshire police have a murder inquiry running and a cordon around High Cross Leys at that junction of Huntingdon Street and Woodborough Road. 60-year-old man is arrested on suspicion of murder on the day itself. That's David Francis. And on the Saturday, a 50-year-old man is arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. Now, over the weekend, the arrests keep coming. A 53-year-old man, a 44-year-old woman on suspicion of murder, 4 more people, 2 men and 2 women on suspicion of assisting an offender. By the Monday, the detective leading the inquiry, Detective Inspector Claire Gibson, confirms there are 8 people in custody, and she's appealing publicly for anyone who saw anything to come forward. One person is missing from those first arrests, though. The man who actually held a knife. The trial would later hear that after leaving the foyer, McLeary and Barlow went first to the home of a man named Gregory Bailey, and then to the home of a man named Danny O'Keefe, and that O'Keefe harboured McLeary for 2 days before police caught up with him. The trial would also hear that the weapons left that flat concealed under Barlow's coat. They have never been recovered. Ricardo's family, in those first days, released a statement through the police. He will be missed by so many people, they said, and they were truly heartbroken. On the 2nd of May 2023, 4 days after Ricardo died, the charges come. Courtney McLeary, 53 of High Cross Leys, David Francis, 60 of Swale Grove, Bingham, Lisa Barlow, 44 of High Cross Leys, all 3 charged with murder. Danny O'Keefe, 49, Gregory Bailey, 50, with assisting an offender. All 5 appeared before Nottingham magistrates that same day. So within a week, the shape of the prosecution's case is visible. Not one killer, a joint attack. Cleary and Francis together as the 2 men who murdered Ricardo, and 3 more people around them who helped afterwards. And that case has a problem though. That will hang over everything that follows. The stabbing happened in a private sitting room in the space of a few seconds, in front of almost no one. There's no camera in that room. The weapons are gone. The 2 accused men aren't saying anything a jury can test, which means that whether this was one man with a knife or 2 men acting together comes down entirely to a single witness, a woman who left that flat so fast she'd never look back, and that was Katrina Intress. Now, Katrina Intress was in her 20s, and by April 2023, she had already lived through more than most people do in a lifetime. Almost everything I can tell you about her comes from one place. The agreed facts read to the jury at trial. 19 of them about her background and medical history alone, later summarised by the Court of Appeal. She spent her childhood years in care. During that childhood, she made allegations of sexual abuse. Those allegations were never proceeded with. She grew up into addiction, to drugs and to alcohol, and she lived with a number of mental health conditions. She had criminal convictions for drug offences and for theft, some of them committed while she was already under a suspended sentence for early offences of the same kind. In the language of the criminal courts, all that made her a witness of what's called bad character. It's a technical term, and lawyers know exactly what it means, but I want to read you what the Court of Appeal, 3 senior judges sitting in the criminal division, said about applying that term to her. They wrote that it can be something of a blunt tool when describing someone who had the sort of life that Katrina Intress had endured. And they went further. It's a general experience of the criminal courts that those who suffer from childhoods of this type will often go on to have very difficult lives. Describing it as a bad character, they said, may not be fully accurate. So let's sit with that for a second, shall we? Because appeal judges do not often write like that about anyone. Katrina knew both men at the centre of the case, and she knew the man who died, Courtney McLeary, had been in a relationship with her mum when she was young. In her own words, he'd been like a stepdad to her all her life. She knew Courtney had taken Ricardo under his wing and let him stay. Ricardo himself, in her words again, was a typical cheeky lad. He had his ups and downs and he had his issues, but he'd always been alright with her. A stepdad on one side, a lad had been alright with her on the other. Whatever Katrina Intress eventually said about that morning, she wasn't an outsider taking a side. She was tied to everyone in that room. So her first account came early, and it came under caution, because in the beginning, the police treated Katrina as a suspect. She was arrested, she was interviewed, and in that interview she told them 2 things that matter enormously. She said that she had not seen a stabbing, and she described David Francis as a peacemaker, a man attempting to break up the altercation between McLeary and Ricardo. So keep both of those in view. Her first account, given closest to the time to Ricardo's death, as Frances trying to stop the violence. Then in May 2023, she spoke to 2 different social workers and she told them 2 different things. To one, she said she knew who had stabbed Ricardo, but she couldn't say because she was frightened. To the other, she said that she hadn't seen the stabbing at all. Neither social worker was prepared to give evidence at the trial, and neither was called up to give evidence at the trial. Through the summer and into the autumn, Katrina was struggling. She was hospitalised at points between April and October. She described herself, in her own word, being in a dilemma. Police went back to her more than once, tried to get a further statement. More than once, she turned them away. Then on the 23rd of October 2023, she stopped turning them away. She sat down with a police officer and signed a full witness statement under the usual form of warning about consequences of telling lies. And in it, she said this, and I'm going to quote her directly. I want to say now that everything in my police interview was true and the best memory of the incident that I gave. I'm giving this account 6 months after all this happened, but what I do want to say is that just before I left the flat, I saw Courtney stab Ricardo. She then described the room. Courtney and Lisa sat next to her on the settee at one side, Ricardo standing in a corner on the opposite side, nearest the living room door. And she described Ricardo in that moment, a young man who, a few hours earlier, had been aggressive and violent and frightening. Like this. She said he seemed like a little boy at that point. He had calmed down and he was quiet. 15 minutes had passed since everything had calmed down. Ricardo wasn't saying anything. And this is her words again. The next thing I know, Courtney had launched himself across the room towards Ricardo. I didn't even really know what was going on. I saw a knife was in Courtney's right hand and I saw him swing towards Ricardo. I remember seeing Ricardo's eyes roll up into the back of his head. Courtney never even said anything. It all happened so quick. I knew I had to leave straight away. I knew I didn't want to be there. And then she said the sentence that would put David Francis in prison. She said, Dave Francis was stood in the doorway of the living room, and as I tried to get past him, Francis tried to stop me by putting his arm out, but I ducked under his arm, left the flat and went straight home. I didn't see Ricardo again or speak to him as I left the flat. I just wanted to get away and I didn't look back. So the peacemaker of her first account is gone. And in this account, Francis stands in the doorway of a room where a man has just been stabbed and puts his arm out. So 8 days later, on the 31st of October 2023, Katrina Intress died. The cause was the acute toxic effects of Class A drugs. In courtroom shorthand that was used later, she died of an overdose. So she was never asked a single question about her statement, not by the police, beyond the taking of it, not by the prosecution, not by the lawyers for the 2 men whose futures now hung on her words. There'd be no cross-examination, no testing, no chance to put her 2 accounts side by side in front of her and ask her which one was true, because 4 months later, when the murder trial of Courtney McLeary and David Francis opened at Nottingham Crown Court, the only eyewitness to the killing of Ricardo Anderson existed in one or few pages of signed paper, speaking for a woman who couldn't speak anymore. So the trial opened at Nottingham Crown Court in late February 2024 before Her Honour Judge Shant KC and ran from late winter into spring. 5 people were in the dock. Courtney McLeary and David Francis, charged with murder, Gregory Bailey and Danny O'Keefe, charged with assisting an offender, and Lisa Barlow, who had already pleaded guilty to assisting an offender, the woman who stepped over Ricardo alongside McLeary, and, the court heard, the woman who carried the weapons out of the building under her coat. So before the jury could hear a word of Katrina Intress' statement, though, the lawyers had to fight about it between themselves. So I want to walk you through that fight, because it becomes the whole of McLeary's appeal. So bear with me a little through a little law here, but I think people like it. I'm going to try and keep it as human as possible. So English law starts from a simple position. Evidence is given by people, in person, in a witness box where it can be tested. A statement from someone who can't be questioned is hearsay, and hearsay is treated with suspicion for a very good reason. Cross-examination is a tool that the courts use to find out whether an account survives pressure. Katrina's account could never face that pressure. But the law also recognises that witnesses die. Section 116 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003 allows a dead witness's statement to be put before a jury. And a safeguard is this. The jury must be given the material to judge that statement's reliability for themselves, since nobody can ask the witness anything. Here earlier, contradictory accounts, convictions, addiction, mental health, time in care, they were given all of it, the jury. And the prosecution applied to admit her statement. Both defense teams fought it hard. Their argument boiled down. The witness gave two irreconcilable accounts. She can't be asked which is true. The jury is asked to choose between the words of a dead woman is being asked to do something that no one can safely do. The judge's job, they said, was to grapple with her reliability at the door of the court and refuse to let her statement the statement in. So Judge Shank gave a written ruling in this. She accepted there were features capable of making Katrina unreliable and features supporting her reliability. So there's features on both sides. She noted that the statement was taken by a police officer, signed under the formal warning about lies. She noted the sheer volume of material the defense could use to attack it, material she described as ample. And she noted something else, concession by the prosecution that she described in her ruling as extremely fair to the defendants. The description the Court of Appeal later endorsed, and the prosecution agreed not to tell the jury that Katrina's explanation for her early silence was fear. The jury would hear her accounts and her background and then decide for themselves. So the statement came in. The jury heard Katrina's words read aloud in a courtroom that she never entered. Alongside them, 37 agreed facts about her life, her medical history, and a long stop-start road to the 3rd of October. The defense pointed the jury back to her first account, the one where she saw nothing and Francis was a peacemaker. So the prosecution's case ran like this. Whatever Ricardo had done earlier that night, by the end he was calm and had been for around 15 minutes. He was standing quietly in the corner of the room, where McLeary crossed it with a knife and stabbed him through the heart. McLeary was the killer. Francis was his secondary partner, and the case for that rested substantially on one image from Katrina's statement. Francis in the doorway, arm out, as she ducked under it and ran. So McLeary's defense was self-defense, or alternatively accident. Ricardo, on the agreed evidence, had been armed and threatening that night, and had terrorized Barlow, in particular Lisa Barlow, that is his partner. McLeary's account to the police was of a struggle, not an execution. Francis's defense, David Francis's defense, was simpler still. He just simply wasn't involved. Whatever he'd done that night had been to calm things down, and when it ended, he was the one man in the building who stayed with the dying. So neither Courtney or David gave evidence. The jury never heard either man questioned. So the trial came down to a dead woman's statement, a silent doc, and CCTV. Then, in his closing speech, prosecution counsel did something that would follow his case all the way to London. He offered the jury an explanation for the foyer footage. Francis holding Ricardo's hand, he suggested. It wasn't compassion at all. David Francis was staying close to the dying man to make sure Ricardo didn't give details of the attack to anyone who came to help. So there was no evidence for that. None had been called, and the suggestion had never been put to anyone at any point in the trial at all. It arrived for the first time in the final speeches, when no witness could answer it. And here's a detail that stayed with me anyway. The jury noticed that they sent a note to the judge on this exact point, note showing they understood that nothing they'd heard in evidence supported that statement. On the 20th of April 2024, jury returned their verdicts. Courtney McLeary, guilty of murder, unanimously. David Francis, guilty of murder by a majority of 10-2. Ian O'Keefe, guilty of assisting an offender. 9 days later, on the 29th of April, Shank passed sentence, life imprisonment for both men, a minimum of 19 years for McLeary, and a minimum of 16.5 years for David Francis. Before he could even apply for parole, sentencing him, the judge says Francis had stayed at the scene, hiding in plain sight. Barlow, Bailey, and O'Keefe each received 2 years for assisting an offender. So Ricardo's family filled the courtroom with him one last time. His mother Hayley told the court that life changed forever on the 20th of April 2023, and that the pain felt in their hearts every day is a physical pain that never leaves. To them, it was over. Men who killed Ricardo Anderson were serving life. David Francis went to prison, convicted murderer, 61-year-old man by the time of his sentencing, with a minimum term that would hold him into his late 70s. And from prison, no, he kept saying what he'd said from the beginning. He hadn't done anything. On the 26th of February 2026, nearly 2 years after the verdicts, the full Court of Appeal granted both men leave to appeal against their convictions. Buried in the procedural record of that decision is a signal of what was coming. When the court granted leave, it made an unusual order. because of what it described as an apparent paucity, so about lack of evidence against David Francis. It ordered the prosecution to produce a schedule, complete written list of every piece of evidence against him, with the defence to respond. So before a single argument could be heard, the country's appeal court had looked at the case against David Francis and asked, in effect, is this it? The appeal was heard on Friday the 12th of June 2026. The Royal Courts of Justice in London, before Lord Justice Fraser, Mrs Justice Cutts, and His Honour Judge Patrick Field, KC. McLeary's case was argued by Rosanna Scomadella, KC. David Francis's by Laurie Anna Power, KC. The Crown's by Andrew Vogt, KC, the same person who had prosecuted the trial in the first place. Judgment was reserved and handed down on the 15th of July 26, 3 days ago from the day I'm recording this. McLeary's appeal stood on one ground. Katrina Intress' statement should never have gone before the jury. David Francis adopted that same ground and added 2 more. The judge should have stopped the case against him when his lawyers argued there was no case to answer, and the prosecution's closing speech had invited the jury to rely on things never put in evidence. So the court took the hearsay question first, and its answer is now the law's clearest recent statement on witnesses like Katrina. So this will be used in future appeals, by the way. The precondition for admitting a dead witness's statement, the court said, is that it must be potentially safely reliable. So Katrina's earlier contradictory account, it didn't disqualify her later one. The law expressly provides for exactly that situation by requiring the contradiction itself to be put before the jury, so that the jurors can see the witness contradicted herself and weigh it up against each other. If inconsistency automatically destroyed a statement, that provision would have no reason to exist. But it does exist. The court also pointed to something that Courtney McLeary's team had no real answer to. There was no evidence of any reason for Katrina to lie about what she saw. And McLeary always had the option of giving evidence himself, of telling the jury what happened in that room, but he never did. Her statement, the judges held, was properly admitted. The jury was properly directed. Whether to believe a woman with Katrina's life and Katrina's convictions was, in the court's phrase, a classic question for a jury. And this is where the judges wrote the passage I read you earlier about bad character being a blunt tool. Somewhat sad features of her life, they said, which affected her reliability, did not mean that she could not be telling the truth. So Courtney McLeary's appeal was dismissed. His conviction for the murder of Ricardo Anderson stands. The jury heard Katrina's account of that knife, weighed everything against her, and accepted it. And the Court of Appeal had ruled that they were entitled to do that. So then the Court of Appeal turned to David Francis and to that schedule of evidence. Everything the Crown had, taken at its highest, as the law requires. Some lies Francis told early on. A nail file found on him when he was arrested, and their theory it might have caused some of Ricardo's superficial cuts. His presence in the flat, and Katrina's image of him in the doorway with his arm out. Against that, the court set the law of joint enterprise, as the Supreme Court restated it in 2016 in a case called Joggy. A secondary party must actually participate, must assist, and must encourage the crime, intending to. And a judgment reached back to Joggy for a sentence that deserves to be heard in full. Guilt of a crime by mere association had no proper part in the common law. Then the judges did something quietly devastating to the prosecution case. They compared Katrina's 2 counts of that doorway. In her final statement, just put his arm out as she passes. In her first account, she described the same man in the same doorway as lounging against the door. Standing in the doorway with your arm across it, the court said, not contributing to force of numbers in an attack. Especially an attack that, on Katrina's own evidence, nobody in the room saw coming. Attack she was clear erupted suddenly, without warning, without a word. The conclusion in the court's own words, the evidence against David Francis amounts to little more than his being present at the scene. He cannot properly be described as a participant. The trial judge should have granted the submission of no case to answer, and the case against him should have ended there, the Court of Appeal said in April 2024, before the jury ever deliberated on his name. So his conviction was unsafe. It was quashed. There would be no retrial because the court's finding was not that a jury got it wrong. It was that there was never enough evidence to ask a jury the question at all. And Ricardo's words in the foyer that he'd been attacked by a group, the court's final answer is stark. On the evidence, the Crown proved one man with a knife Whatever Ricardo believed was happening to him in that room, the case for a second attacker was never there. The court dealt with the closing speech briefly because it no longer needed deciding, but the judges said this much: the suggestion that David Francis held Diamond's hand to keep him quiet was not, as the Crown maintained, acceptable comment on the evidence. It invited the jury to speculate, and the jury, the court noted, had been astute enough to see it and to say so in the notes. So David Francis walked out of prison a free man a few days ago, 63 years old, having served more than 2 years of a life sentence for a murder the Court of Appeal says should never have reached a jury. So the last image the law has of him and Ricardo Anderson is the same one it started with: a foyer, a dying young man, and the only person from that flat who stayed with him. So where does that leave everyone in July 2026? Courtney McLeary is serving a life imprisonment for the murder of Ricardo Anderson. His minimum term is 19 years. Every court that has looked at the case has reached the same conclusion about him. He crossed that room with a knife, and a young man who had calmed down, who seemed like a little boy at that point, died on the floor of a foyer while McLeary walked past him and away. Ricardo's family have that answer, at least, and they will always have it. Nothing in the Court of Appeal's judgment disturbs it. And David Francis is free. He's 63 years old. He spent more than 2 years inside on a life sentence, branded a murderer for a case the Court of Appeal says should never be left to a jury. There's no ceremony for that kind of release, no apology built into the system, and under the law as it stands, compensation for a quashed conviction is far from automatic. It's confined to a very narrow set of cases, and a finding that the evidence was never sufficient doesn't by itself open that door. A man convicted of murder in front of his community got a judgment on his liberty. That's what the process provides. What the past 2 years took from him, the process doesn't measure. And Katrina Intress, she's been dead for more than 2.5 years now, and she never knew any of this happened. Her statement did two things that no one could have predicted when she signed it. It convicted 2 men of murder, and then, read again more carefully, it freed one of them, because the detail that undid the case against Francis wasn't dug up by investigators or uncovered by new science. It was sitting in Katrina's own words the entire time, in the gap between a man lounging against a door and a man barring a door. The jury accepted her account of the knife. The courts just refused to let anyone stretch her words further than that she took them herself. So I keep coming back to what the Court of Appeal wrote about her, because I think it's the most important thing in this judgment, that a life spent in care, in addiction, in and out of the courts, is not the same as a life spent lying. People who witness killings in flats like High Cross Leys will almost never be polished witnesses. If their word counts for nothing, then what happens in those rooms stays in those rooms forever. Katrina Intress was, on any view, one of the most vulnerable people in this whole story. The last thing she ever did, it is before she died, told the police what she saw, and the Court of Appeal took her very seriously. But this story belongs with Ricardo, so I'm going to finish with him. Ricardo Anderson was 22, a dad, a son, brother, and an uncle, a cheeky lad with his ups and downs, sleeping on the floor because he had nowhere else to go, taken in by the man who killed him. His mother told the courtroom that he's now the brightest star in the sky, looking down on his family every day. Whatever the law went on to say about the men in that flat, and it had now said all of it, none of it changes. The only fact that matters to the people who loved him. He should be in his mid-20s now, and he isn't. That's a shame. So everyone, I hope this was okay. We'll be back at some point soon, probably the same time next week with another episode. And until then, please stay happy and take care.